Hey guys, I'll wait a couple minutes and see if anybody else joins. Who else here? Hey Reese, how are you? Yeah, so there's a Zoom meeting at 3 o'clock for Euro. Who's loose? Because I might not have your email. So if you give me your email. Oh, Jerry, I sent it to you. Just check your email. Check, if you check your email, you should have a link. And I'll see you at 3 o'clock. Hey Reem, Natasha, Jacob, Audrey. Okay, so I'm gonna do like a brief overview of the major religions and then go through questions that people have posted in the discussion. There's a lot of questions about syncretism and the different types of religions, so I'm gonna kind of sort through some of that. But yeah, let's just get started. So the big regions. So we'll look at each region and discuss the major religion in each region. But then obviously there's the migration of those religions depending on the time period. So we'll just start with Europe and the Mediterranean world. And I'm not going with a specific time period. Actually, maybe I should go with a specific time period. So then in that case, I'll start with India. I'll start with the oldest religion. I'm teaching my students right now. What? You don't need to tell me, just go. Okay. So we'll start with India, and we'll run through Hinduism and Buddhism. And those religions began, well, Hinduism's really old. We don't actually have a date on when Hinduism begins. But the main thing to remember with Hinduism is it's based on the idea of rebirth, right? Of reincarnation. So you have your current life that you're living, and when you die, you don't die and go to, your soul, your spirit is reborn. That spirit is reborn into another being, whether that being is another person or an animal or something like that. That depends on how you lived your current life. And there's two things that your current life is based on. How good your life is. And so this connects to the caste system in India really well because it's based on ranks. So, you have the farmers, and at the very bottom you have the untouchables, and then you have your farmers, and then you have your craftsmen and merchants, and then you have your nobles and your kings, and then you have your priests at the top, the Brahmins, right? And so you can move up or down. So if you're currently a Kshatriya, a warrior, then if you live a good life, you can move up to a Brahmin in your next life. Or if you lived a bad life, you could move down to something else, like a Vaishya, okay, which is the merchant class. And so there's an internal motivation to live your life well, so that you can be reincarnated to the next level in a future life. And so there's two things that determine whether or not your life is good or not. The first is dharma, and this is probably the most important one, and this is what keeps people in their caste. Living your dharma means that you are living your duty. You're doing your cultural um, responsibilities. You're filling those responsibilities. So, for instance, if I'm a Vaisya, then my job is to be a merchant. And so maybe that means I'm a baker. So that means that I'm going to be a baker, you know, for the rest of my life, and I'm going to do my best to do a good job as a baker. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the deal there. Um, Now, the second thing that informs your position of being reincarnated is your karma. And karma is your good actions versus your bad actions. You can kind of think of it as the global balance of your good versus your bad. And so this also encourages right behavior. Um, and karma is important when it comes to how people interact with one another. And so Hinduism creates a self sustaining system to a large degree because there's an intrinsic motivation to do your specific duty, your dharma, and to do it well, to fulfill your karma. Does that make sense? And so that means that for most of its history, India kind of has been able to self regulate through Hinduism and the caste system without need for major centralized governments. And so India's civilization has always been important historically, even though they haven't necessarily had huge empires at all their time periods. A really classic example of sort of the staying power of Indian culture is sort of how the caste system sustains basic Indian society throughout the millennia. But if you take a look at a place like Rome, for instance, when the Roman Empire falls, most of the customs of the Roman Empire disappear with it. I mean, there are segments and parts of, the Latin world that stay, but Christianity being the largest. But we don't ever see Rome again, even though, people like the Russians and the Germans will claim to be Roman. They're not. Um, and so that kind of just indicates the cultural staying power that you have with Hinduism and the caste system. Now, the primary religion that comes out of Hinduism is Buddhism. Now, in Hinduism, the goal is actually not to just be reincarnated to a higher caste. The goal is to be released from the system of rebirth altogether. But you can only do that from a high caste. So you would have to be like a Brahmin. So if you're talking about if you're a poor person, if you're a laborer, let's say you're an untouchable. If you're an untouchable in Hinduism, then you would have to live multiple good lives before you even have a chance at being released into the to achieve moksha, which is the term for this release of the soul into this uh, energy life force that sort of surrounds the universe. That's a long time, and you're going to have a very hard road ahead as far as achieving that. And so, bye night. So one of the chief religions that comes out of Hinduism is Buddhism, and Buddhism is based on some of the same ideas. Buddhists still believe in reincarnation. They still believe in karma. So a lot of the same ideas are there. The big difference, the big change that Buddhism makes is the idea that moksha can be achieved in one lifetime instead of several. And they changed the name moksha to nirvana. So nirvana, release from the world, can be obtained in one lifetime. And instead of having to live multiple good lives, all you have to do is live one good life where you follow a set prescription of living for living. And this set prescription for living is known as the Eightfold Path. Okay, so the Eightfold Path is the things that you have to do to achieve nirvana in your lifetime. And so uh, Buddhism is popular automatically amongst certain parts of Indian society, especially poor people and women, because those are the people that are the furthest away from enlightenment in Indian society. And it's worth noting in Indian society is extremely patriarchal historically, and so so a woman, it would be an upgrade to be reincarnated as a man. Okay, so women are at the bottom of the social order in Indian society, and so nirvana and the ideas of Buddhism were popular. The problem that Buddhism has initially in spreading is that doing the Eightfold Path by yourself is really difficult. It requires a lot of self sacrifice, asceticism. Asceticism is an important term to remember. It basically means giving up material pleasures. So, giving up, your land, your ability to have a family, your ability to wear specific clothes or even have hair. Those are all parts of being a Buddhist monk, basically. Monasticism is the practice of asceticism with groups of people. And so these Buddhists, it does spread amongst the lower caste Hindus originally, but it's not going to be super popular among other groups that are very common when you're talking about like the spread of religions overseas into lots of places. And if we're thinking about like who really spreads religions, a lot of times it's merchants. And merchants obviously are not going to give up material wealth because their whole livelihood revolves around material wealth. So standard normal ascetic Buddhism is not popular with the monks. What changes and what really makes Buddhism spread as a world religion is the idea that other people, other monks, can help you. And you have these really special people called bodhisattvas who have basically foregone reincarnation. They achieved nirvana, they got enlightenment, but instead of going, and taking that enlightenment, what they've done is that they have agreed to be reincarnated over and over again to help other people achieve the goals of the Eightfold Path. And this is a key characteristic of what we call Mahayana Buddhism. A bodhisattva, I think it's, here, I'll just type it into the chat. That might not be 100% right, but it's close enough. And then the type of Buddhism we're talking about here is called Mahayana Buddhism, which is, there are three schools of Buddhism that come out, that branch out of the main, what the Buddha originally comes up with. So there's three schools. The only one you need to know is Mahayana Buddhism. It's the most popular and widespread version of Buddhism. It's the one that spreads into China. Okay, and because that's the one that spreads into China, that's also the one that largely spreads into Vietnam and Korea and Japan as well. I said it's the only one you need to know. We'll talk a little bit about Zen Buddhism as well, but Zen Buddhism is it's honestly another branch of Mahayana Buddhism. We're not going to talk about the other two main branches of Buddhism. So, just like any other religion, in Islam you have Sunnis and Shiites. In Christianity you have Orthodox and Catholic, and then in the Catholic tradition you have Catholics and Protestants. In Buddhism you have the same thing. You have Vajrayana, Mahayana, and Theravada Buddhism. The only one that we're really going to concern ourselves with is Mahayana, and Zen Buddhism is a branch off of Mahayana Buddhism. So Mahayana means will, and I think of it in this way. So carts have wheels on them, and they are carried by merchants who are trading goods. And so this is the Buddhism that is spreading, and it is spreading because it is the Buddhism that merchants adopt. So why are merchants adopting this religion? Because they're able to say prayers and perform rituals that sort of serve in lieu of being an ascetic. And then you have monks who serve more like the clergy, and the bodhisattvas, who serve more like saints and people to worship. And so the bodhisattvas can be worshipped um, almost like you would see other religions worship gods or view them, venerate them as saints. And so this is a much more popular religion than the original idea of Buddhism, and this is the one that's spreading around. So when you think about sort of like what makes a popular religion, like people to pray to, having temples to go to, serving certain pilgrimages, doing that kind of stuff, Mahayana has all of those aspects. Mahayana Buddhism does. And this spreads very early on out of India and into China, into Southeast Asia. And it also spreads into Central Asia as well. Central Asia is going to develop a lot of Buddhist stuff. And in fact, in Central Asia today, like a really good example is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had all these massive Buddhist sculptures and stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of those Buddhist carvings and stuff were blown up and destroyed by the Taliban because they were viewed as, sacrilegious because, of the fundamental Islamic movements that were going on with the Taliban. And so some of that stuff has been destroyed. But Central Asia was really converted to Buddhism before it then converted to Islam. Now, on the discussion board, someone asked a question that I thought was kind of interesting. Caitlin said, did Buddhism ever really take root in Europe at all? And the answer to that is no. Buddhism never really is going to take root in Europe. It doesn't spread that far. And the closest it's going to spread is, into Eastern, into the Caucasus region, Georgia, Azerbaijan, that kind of stuff is the closest it's going to get. And the problem is that you're running into Christianity by the time Buddhism gets out into that area. So Buddhism is spreading, but it starts around 500 BC. But really, by the time Buddhism is hitting its stride, you're into the first and second century, and by that time, Christianity is starting to gain a foothold in the Roman Empire, and especially by 500, Christianity is the predominant religion of Europe, and the Byzantine Empire is Christian, and you're hitting a lot of other prominent religions that are going to, stop the spread of Buddhism. And then also geographically, India is quite far from Europe, and so the geographic barriers there are kind of significant. I guess you could make the argument that China converted to Buddhism, but I would say that the Christianity, because it's a monotheistic religion, it's more difficult to rip people away from a monotheistic religion than it is from more of like a philosophical tradition school like China had. Like China didn't have a specific religion. Instead, they had these philosophies that were more flexible. So let's actually talk about Chinese religion for a moment, since you've got the major schools of thought for China. I'm going to kind of skip over legalism, honestly. I don't think that that's going to come up. So let's just look predominantly at Confucianism. So Confucianism is based off of 5 relationships. If you don't know the specific 5 relationships, that's fine, but you should know the 2 big important relationships, which are father and son, and then husband and wife. And the father and son relationship can really be extrapolated out to the ruler of a kingdom. So, for instance, the emperor is viewed as the father of the Chinese people. And in fact, you might see primary source documents that refer to the emperor as the father. And if you see that, you should immediately think to yourself, Confucianism. This is the idea of Confucianism. Okay? But Confucianism is this idea of these relationships and how people should act in those relationships, with some people being, above others and other people being below others. And if you're above, if you're in the higher category, then, you're supposed to protect, provide for, and care for the people below you. And then if you're in the lower category, you're supposed to respect and obey the people above. So the son should respect and obey his father, and the father should provide for and care for his son. And if that relationship works both ways, then you really don't have that much of an issue. Like, if you respect and obey your father, and your father cares for you and provides for you, then you don't really have that big of a problem, respecting him and obeying him, because he's doing the things for you. And so if these relationships are reciprocal, and they work very well. So there's a huge emphasis on Chinese culture on having these reciprocal relationships. And it puts a lot of responsibility on fathers, and it puts a lot of responsibility on the leaders in Chinese history to sort of reflect that attitude towards their people. And we see this with the Chinese officials as well. They view themselves in that sort of fatherly position. And this idea of the father over the son is called filial piety. And I'm just writing that down in there. Mother and son relationships. So it's weird because with with a mother and daughter relationship, the concept of filial piety would be more important. With the mother and son, the relationship is important when the child is young, but once the boy is considered a man, Chinese ideas of patriarchy begin to take over. Chinese patriarchal ideas begin to take over, and once the son is grown, especially if the father dies. If the father dies, then the oldest son becomes like the father of the household. Does that make sense? The oldest male is always the most important person in Chinese society. Whoever the oldest male is, that's what the filial piety is. So there was some confusion, I felt like, in the chat, in the discussion board, over filial piety and patriarchy. So just remember, filial piety is the father-son relationship, whereas patriarchy deals more with women and men and their relationships. So it would usually be the husband-wife relationship, but it could also deal with the father-daughter relationship. The daughter's sort of the responsibility of the father until she gets married. And so one of the reasons why marriage is such a big deal in any ancient society, but in Chinese society especially, is the idea that the woman is going from being a burden of her father to being the burden of her husband. Okay. And sorry, ladies, to describe you as a burden. I know that you're not burdens, but back in ancient China, they thought that women were burdens. And in ancient India, and pretty much in every ancient civilization, that patriarchy is always going to be a correct answer for this time period, basically, unless you're in Africa. If you're in Africa, it's not a correct answer. They're the exception. The opposite, there really isn't an opposite of patriarchy. There's a matrilineal society. There's a matrilineal society, and I really don't want to go into that right now because it's going to take too long to describe. But basically, the lineage is tracked through the mother's side, and so that means that the things that are important for a patrilineal society, tracking your parentage through your father's side. There really hasn't ever been a matriarchy. There are societies that live and track their lineage matrilineally, but they are not. When that happens, there's really no need to protect. This is going to get way. I'm going to have to go into a 20-minute discussion on this if we get into this, and I really don't want to do that because I have a meeting with Euro before too long. All right. So anyway, that's kind of the overview of Confucianism. Now, there's also Daoism in China, and Daoism is sort of like the secondary religion that's almost as important. Well, it's hugely influential in Chinese history, but it's not as important as Confucianism. And basically, Daoism is the focus on nature and the idea that people can't overcome their environments, and so therefore people should live within the restrictions of their environment. And Daoism, there are straight up Daoists, but Daoism gets super mixed up with other stuff. And so you're going to see Daoism in lots of things. And and anytime a religion can easily be mixed with others, that's going to mean syncretism, right? And so we see Daoism is heavily involved in Syncretic Faiths throughout China and the rest of East Asia. So we'll come back to that when I get to my little spiel on syncretism in a minute. And then in Europe, the predominant religion is Christianity. Christianity begins, in the year, right where the years turn over with Jesus's death. But Christianity doesn't become a hugely popular religion until about 300 years after Jesus's death. Now it becomes more and more popular as it catches on with the poor people in the Roman Empire, and Christianity really does begin. Jesus is executed by the Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire itself facilitates the spread of Christianity accidentally. It doesn't mean to, and that's kind of the funny thing about empires, is that sometimes they do things they don't mean to do. In fact, I would say Christianity is probably the largest lasting legacy of the Roman Empire, and they didn't even mean for it to happen. But the road system and the ports and all of the easy access to travel made the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire very easy. And so when you look at missionaries like Paul's the most important missionary in the history of Christianity. And if you're wondering, who's this Paul guy? Well, if you read the New Testament of the Bible, the second half of the New Testament is basically all written by Paul. They're all a bunch of letters that he wrote to the different churches that he had established across the area, correcting them on issues or explaining to them certain parts of Christian doctrine. And so Paul is the most influential character in the history of Christianity outside of Jesus himself. And Paul's specific mission was converting people that were not Jewish. So he was mostly converting Greeks and Romans. The letters of Paul have a specific name. They're actually called epistles. And if you go to church or something and the pastor's like, we're going to read from the epistle of Paul. Yeah, that's just, it's a fancy way of saying one of his letters. So anyway, missionaries and spread amongst the poor people. He was not a part of Jesus's 12. No, Paul was converted after Jesus's death. Peter was part of so Peter's mission was to convert the Jewish people to Christianity. Paul's mission was to convert the Greeks and the Romans to Christianity. But anyway, so the basic idea of why Christianity is popular is because of the idea of heaven and the idea, and if you look at Jesus's message about heaven and who's going to be, well, he doesn't specifically mention heaven, but who he says is going to be honored in the next life. He says, "Blessed are the weak, blessed are the poor people, the slaves," and he kind of points to the ideas of the lower classes being the ones that are going to reap benefits in the future. And so this is popular if you're a lower class member of society. And there were a lot of lower class members in Roman society. Over 50% of the Roman population across the empire was enslaved. And then women were also held up prominently in the Gospels, which are the books describing Jesus's life. You have very many prominent women like Mary Magdalene and Martha, and women that are considered to be important to Jesus, and they're treated in a way that is reflective of how some women probably would have rather been treated, and so women were converts as well. And so the lower classes begin to convert in the Roman Empire, and by the year 100 to 200, I don't remember the exact numbers, but 10% or more of the Roman population is Christian. But the big change comes when Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire himself, converts to Christianity. And he does this after he wins a battle called the Battle of Milvian Bridge, in which he has this dream where everyone paints this Christian symbol on their shields, they'll win the battle. So he has all his soldiers paint the Christian symbol on their shields and they win the battle. And he's like, well, I guess this works. And so he converts to Christianity. And when he converts to Christianity, and Constantine is the guy who establishes Constantinople as the new capital of Rome, which becomes kind of a big deal later on. And so it converts and changes, because once the big dog converts to a religion, other people are going to convert to that religion too. And so once the emperor of Rome is Christian, then the Roman Empire, the official religion, eventually is going to become Christianity as well. Theodosius is the emperor that actually makes the empire officially Christian. And so when you think about the conversion of Europe to Christianity, it starts in the Roman Empire. And, if you're looking at Europe and North Africa, this is the Mediterranean Sea, right? North Africa's down here, Europe's up here. You said this is the epicenter of Christianity. So Christianity is going to spread to the north into Europe, but it's also going to spread to the south into North Africa. And North Africa in particular, Egypt, did convert to Christianity and was an important part of the Christian community. And then that Christianity actually spread southward along the Nile River into Ethiopia. And so you guys remember when we were talking about the colonization of Africa, I mentioned that Ethiopia was Christian. And that was because of this history of Christianity going down the Nile River after the Roman Empire. So that's kind of interesting. So Christianity spreads, and its spread is pretty significant during this time period into Europe. That's the biggest spread. And we'll talk a little bit about that spread into the north when we get into the syncretism part of this discussion. I want to move into Islam real quick. So Islam begins in about 600. So by this time, Christianity is solidly in place in Europe. Christianity is becoming the sort of key religion. Buddhism is rooted into China, East Asia, but also into Central Asia. And then Islam comes out of the Middle East, and it basically takes a lot of the ideas from Judaism, which of course was the root for Christianity, and then it takes the ideas from Christianity, and then it adds to those. So your Eastern religions are like Hinduism and Buddhism. They come out of the same school. And then you have the Chinese religions, and then you have your Western religions, which is Judaism at the root, and then you have Christianity, and then you have Islam, and those all come out of that. And so if you were to study these religions, you would start noting a lot of similarities. So for instance, all Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all talk about Abraham. Abraham's a big character in all of those because he's considered to be like the founding father. He's the guy that talks to God first, kind of. Well, unless you talk about like Adam or something. But he's like the guy in the Middle East that God visits and basically says, "Hey, I'm going to make your people great." And so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all often referred to as Abrahamic religions because of this common ancestry that they share with Abraham. So Islam is different in that, so throughout the Christian and Jewish religions, you have all these different prophets, right, that come and tell people God's will. With Islam, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, he claims that God comes to him and says that, hey, you're a prophet, tell the people my will, but not only are you a prophet, you're the last prophet. There won't be any other prophets after you. And so that makes you special. And so one of the things that you see in Islam is this idea that anyone, like, so in Christianity, you'll have people come along that'll branch off of Christianity and claim to be prophets of God. I'm not going to go into specific details, but there are all sorts of branches of Christianity where certain individuals have said, like, hey, I'm the God's new prophet or whatever, do this. But you don't ever see that in Islam, because if you were to do that in Islam, you would be blaspheming, because Muhammad is, that it's like the one thing that they consistently talk about in Islam is, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And by the way, he was the last prophet, so there aren't going to be any more. Now, the way Islam spreads is kind of interesting. It has everything to do with the popularity of the message, in addition to the power that Muhammad is able to develop, and the fact that the religion is very unifying for the pastoral peoples of Saudi Arabia. So it prohibits, well, what is modern day Saudi Arabia? So Islam prohibits Arab people Muslims from harming other Muslims. And so the traditional ways of living in the Arab world were sort of done away with, the idea of raiding other groups of people and stuff like that. And so instead, they end up unifying and going out and raiding other areas, particularly the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, and they take over and create this huge empire of their own. And one thing that I would tell you about religions in general is that monotheistic religions are more likely to spread. They're better spreaders than polytheistic religions. And so once Islam gets out of the Arabian Peninsula and begins to move, it spreads into other areas very easily, very quickly, because the idea of a one God is more powerful for individuals who want to control areas than the idea of multiple gods. In addition, having one specific God is an idea that people can easily grasp and understand. And so monotheistic religions, it shouldn't be any surprise that monotheistic religions are the most common religions in the world, specifically Christianity and Islam. They're the number 1 and 2 religions in the world today. And so remember how I said that Central Asia had sort of become this huge hotspot for Buddhism? Well, as Islam spreads out of the Arabian Peninsula, it spreads into Central Asia. And a lot of the people who had converted to Buddhism convert to Islam. In addition, a lot of those people were merchants, and Islam is even better for merchants than Buddhism is because it protects merchants. Merchants love Islam. And another area is in northern India. In northern India, a lot of the Buddhists that were remaining in northern India also converted to Islam as well. And so, if you were looking for where the Muslims in India are, they're largely in northern India and now in modern day Pakistan after the split of India after World War II. But Islam spreads as far as Western China. If you go into West China today, in fact, when I was in China a few years ago, we were in Xi'an, which was the ancient capital of China. But even there's a pretty distinctive Islamic population. They have an area called the Muslim Quarter, where you find some more mosques and things like that. And so Islam has a huge spread, not just into North Africa, where it takes over for Christianity in Egypt, but also into Central Asia, where it becomes the predominant religion there. Okay, so that's the main religions. Any questions on those main religions? Okay, what I'm going to do is quickly run through syncretic ideas from this time period. So just a refresher, syncretism is the blending of religions. And there are several religions that tend to blend easily. I'll answer it as soon as you get it typed out. One of the things about syncretism that I would remember is that you have religions that are dominant and then you have religions that are not as dominant. The dominant religions usually are going to be more obvious, and then they'll pick up characteristics of the religions that aren't as dominant. Does that make sense? So for instance, Christianity, when it syncretizes in Europe, it doesn't, we don't even recognize the version of Christianity most Christians in the United States practice today is a syncretized version of Christianity. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's the example I was actually going to use in a second. So there are elements of, there's nothing, let's talk about Christmas. Why not? So there's nothing about putting a pine tree in your living room during Christmas, okay? If you go through and read the account of Jesus' birth in the New Testament, it doesn't say, and then after the baby was born, Joseph chopped down the tallest cedar tree and put it up next to the manger. No, that's not there. So where does this idea of greenery and Christmas trees and stuff come from? That comes from the pagan rituals that were already in practice in Northern Europe. And one of the ways in which Christianity was spread into Northern Europe was by incorporating ideas that were already there, because people don't like entirely new, like people like to take new ideas in little chunks at a time. They don't like to take it all at once. So, for instance, okay, I'll take parts of your religious idea, but I want to keep certain parts of my ideas. I particularly like my winter solstice holiday, right? I like my winter solstice holiday. I want to do my winter solstice holiday because we've always done it. And so, when the Roman Catholic Church is trying to introduce Christmas as a holiday, they basically say, okay, guys, keep your traditional winter solstice holiday, and we'll just make that Christmas now. And so you'll keep a lot of your same traditions, like, putting up a Christmas tree or mistletoe holding a place of importance, but then we'll blend it with the birth of Jesus, and we'll have it in December, even though pretty much every scholar on earth says that Jesus was definitely not born in December. He was probably born sometime in the spring or summer. Okay, so Jakir is just asking if what's the primary difference between Confucianism and Daoism? Confucianism is just relationships, human relationships. How do I relate to my daughter? How do I relate to my son? How do I relate to my wife? Taoism is how do I relate to nature as a whole? So that tree outside, how do I relate to it? How do I interact with it? Does that make sense? That's kind of the easiest way to think of it. And the general idea with Taoism is that the overarching environment, the overarching universe is more powerful than human ideas are. And so we should try to make sure that we're living in harmony. And so the idea of harmony and balance is really important in Taoism as well. But that can easily be blended into Confucianism because the idea of harmony and balance within a family is important as well. And so we absolutely get syncretism between Taoism and Confucianism pretty quickly and pretty easily in a lot of cases. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, another example of syncretism in a more dominant monotheistic religion is with Islam in Africa. So when Islam goes into West Africa, it syncretizes with the animistic religions there. So it's very similar to Christianity syncretizing with the animistic religions in Europe. So the kind of thing you want to think of is really anytime a big monotheistic religion moves into an area that doesn't have a big monotheistic religion already, it will pick up elements of the animistic faiths that are there. Okay? I'm going to say that again because I actually think it's a really important idea. Anytime a big monotheistic religion moves into an area that does not have a big monotheistic religion already there, it's going to implant itself and then pick up elements of the animistic traditions that are there. So Christianity, it moves into Northern Europe. Northern Europe didn't have another big monotheistic religion, but there were lots of animistic religions. So Christianity picked up all of those animistic traditions. In West Africa, Islam, when it moves into West Africa, there were no big monotheistic religions present. And so when Islam gets into West Africa, it picks up those animistic traditions as well. And then even in the next unit, when we look at this, yeah, absolutely, you're one step ahead of me. When the Spanish move into the Americas and bring Catholicism with them, there wasn't already big monotheistic religion in the Americas, and so Christianity, Catholicism picks up elements of animism. Does this also play? So polytheism and animism, you can kind of think of them as the same here. When we're talking about animistic religions, they're usually polytheistic because it's the idea that there are certain spirits governing certain aspects of. So you have a fire god, you have a water god, you have a river spirit, you have a tree spirit, whatever. Does that make sense? So we could call those polytheistic. The only exception to any of that, is India. India is the big exception because Hinduism is polytheistic, but Hinduism also, Hindus don't really convert. And that's because Hinduism is super flexible. And so it tends to absorb the monotheistic religions. And so you still get syncretism. Like, for instance, you get, in some examples, we've seen Muhammad and Jesus being pulled into the pantheon of Hindu gods in some areas, where where basically missionaries have gone to India and tried to convert people, and they were like, "Oh, I like Jesus. Oh, I like Muhammad. Um, he reminds me a lot of Krishna. Let's just put him into the pantheon with everybody else." And so Hinduism's kind of a mixed bag in some regards, and Hinduism it doesn't easily convert. Hindu people don't usually try to convert people, and they don't usually convert. It's a huge ethnic religion. It's very different from your big proselytizing religions or universalizing religions like Christianity and Islam. Okay, another example. So Islam in Africa. How's that an example of syncretism? For instance, the local people would oftentimes take pages of the Quran and then they would put them in their pockets and carry them for good luck. In fact, I was playing a little quiz game the other day, and it was like make up a fact about something or the other. And it was talking about Menelik II of Ethiopia, and it said, what was one of the things that he did, or something like that. And the answer is that he would eat page. Oh, what did Menelik II eat? Was the question to feel holy or something like that. And the answer was pages of the Bible. And it's another example of syncretism because basically in Africa, the idea of carrying something with you or ingesting something that would have a good spirit was heavily embedded in African society as a good luck token or something to protect you from evil spirits. And so when the larger religions came in, they were like, oh, this Quran, this book is holy, or oh, this Bible, this book is holy. I should make sure that I have it with me. So, maybe I'll put it on my neck and carry pages of the Bible around. And of course, in Islam or Christianity, either one, it's not the book itself that's holy. That's not the thing with the power. It's what it says that's the power. But there was, especially amongst the less educated people, that didn't quite translate. And so that's one example of sort of how that happened. Okay, in Asia, there's several examples of syncretism during this time period. One example is Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is a mixture of Daoism with Buddhism. Okay, so Buddhism comes into China and really kind of shakes things up because it's more spiritual. So, China had Confucianism already, which was more rigid and rule based. You kind of want to think of it as like the type A. This is the type A way of thinking. This is how things are done. This is how we've always done them. And then Buddhism comes in. It's more like, let's go with the flow. Well, that whole idea of going with the flow kind of can fit with Taoism really easily. And so you have Taoism and Buddhism converge to create sort of a more chill version of Buddhism, I guess you'd say. And actually in China, it was called Chan Buddhism. But this form of Buddhism then spread out into places like Japan and became very popular. So that's another example as well. Shintoism in Japan also blended with Buddhism and blended with other Chinese religions as well. So Shinto, which is the traditional animistic religion of Japan, you might see elements of that. And then the big one for China is Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism is kind of tough for students to understand sometimes, and I don't really think it needs to be. Just understand it as a really strict version of Confucianism, but it pulls in elements of Buddhism and Taoism. That said, even though it's pulling in elements of Buddhism and Taoism, if you were to ask a Neo-Confucianist about it, they would kind of like deny it because they viewed themselves to be the more rational philosophical types. They wanted to be the opposite of Zen Buddhism, basically. So Zen Buddhism is like more mystical and like, let's get in harmony with the universe and everything. Whereas Neo-Confucianism is like, no, the rule is this is how people are supposed to live, etc. And that's kind of how that was viewed. But it pulls in parts. What elements of Buddhism and Taoism are in Neo-Confucianism? This small parts, mostly ritualistic stuff. So certain like the importance of gardens, for instance. So in Chinese, the Chinese royalty and the Chinese officials were like really big on having gardens And even the most neo-Confucian leaders would make sure that they had gardens and spend time in the gardens, and the gardens were very focused on balance. And you would have these ideas from Daoism sort of pulled into even what was considered to be very neo-Confucianist regime. Does that make sense? So that's kind of how. And then in other cases, neo-Confucianism is a result of some of the mystic religions like Zen Buddhism that came into play, and then also the idea of individuality and people sort of fulfilling their role individually in society. That emphasis on the individual and the individual's responsibility partly comes from Buddhism. I'm not an expert on that, but that's some examples of how. And then the last thing, and then I'm going to cut out because it's been almost an hour. The last thing is there's another example of Hinduism and Buddhism blending in Southeast Asia. So that's called Hindu-Buddhism. And that's basically what happened in Southeast Asia was you had Buddhist merchants go down into, or you'd have Hindu merchants go down into Southeast Asia and take their religion with them. And then you would have Buddhist merchants come down and bring their ideas of religion with them, and they would blend up. So if you think about like some of the areas that were big Hindu Buddhist regions, places like Sri Vijaya or Majapahit, those areas were sort of a center of trade and movement of goods across the Indian Ocean, and especially from the Indian Ocean into the South China Sea. And so they would have seen lots of those people groups. And then finally, Islam eventually comes in, and people are going to convert into Islam in Indonesia as well. And so, then you get the Malaccan Sultanate, for example. And once Islam comes in, Islam is going to be more, it's going to take over and become more important and popular than like Buddhism or Hinduism. But yeah, is the sacred feminine in Christianity an example of syncretism? Just based off the name, I would say yeah, but I don't even know. Is that Mary? Is that like the idea that Mary is someone to be prayed to? I'm not Catholic, and I don't know a lot about the specifics there. The answer is almost always yes when it comes to syncretism, because there's always examples of cross pollination of different ideas and people taking parts. Yeah, I watched the Da Vinci Code. Why? Is that part of the Da Vinci Code? Yeah, I don't know. Y'all lost me. All right, so that kind of covers syncretism. Were there any specific questions that people had about religion? I'm going to look through the chat real quick, or the discussion board, and see if I see any big ones. This is an interesting question. How did women specifically contribute to the spread of Islam? And if they did, were they frowned upon by men? As far as I know, women were not huge in spreading Islam, because, I mean, maybe in some earlier years. I don't know. I would say no for the most part. And yes, later on, especially, that would have been frowned upon by men. Someone said, what was the problem between Confucianism and Buddhism? So let me address this real quick, because I think it's an important idea. Confucianism was the state religion of the Han Dynasty in China. And when the Han Dynasty fell, that's about when Buddhism began to seep into China. Buddhism specifically focuses on the individual doing their eightfold path so that they can achieve their salvation. If I convert to Buddhism and become a monk and go live in a monastery and don't have children, number one, I'm abandoning my role as a father, which is an important part of Confucian belief. But number two, I'm abandoning my role as a son. I'm not going to take care of my father when he gets old because I'm off seeking my own gain. Now, to a strict Confucianist, that would seem very selfish, right? And it's even worse if a woman does it, because then she's abandoning their role as a wife and a potential caregiver for children, in addition to a caregiver for their father. And so this kind of is viewed by a lot of the people in China at the time as something that would cause the system as a whole to break down. And so there's a lot of conflict between Buddhism and Confucianism. When Confucianism begins to gain, when Buddhism begins to gain ground in China, and then when the Tang Dynasty is established, Confucianism kind of comes back in full force, and they really begin to push the Buddhists out. Now, there's one funny exception there, which is Empress Wu, who's the only female empress in Chinese history, and she actually promotes Buddhism actively. But of course, the reason she promotes Buddhism actively is because Confucianism doesn't support the idea of a female emperor, but Buddhism doesn't have anything against it. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. I don't really have to teach that anymore, but I figured I'd tell you. I heard the AP test would only cover half of the year. Is there any validity to this? Is the rest of our time online going to be review other than covering the Cold War? So, okay, so the situation is it's only going to cover up to 1900. So it's definitely going to cover more than half, but it's going to cover from 1200 to 1900. So we're not going to be looking at anything. We're going to go, basically, Jacob, we're going to review from 1200 to 1900. You'll take the AP exam, and then the rest of the year we're going to cover the Cold War and the 2 units that we didn't cover, and then your final exam will be based off that for class. Your final class exam will be based off of that. I'm hoping we go back to school because I can't stand a whole lot longer of this. Are you going to do another live stream about point of views? Because I'm still confused about how to really figure out the reason why someone wrote something or who they are talking to. Yes, I would like to do that. Absolutely. I'm also working on grading the point of views exercise that you did, and because your name begins with a W, I've obviously not gotten to yours yet. I think I've just graded the A's. So I'm providing feedback on all those as I go through them. So I will take a look at how you're doing on those. It might not be until the end of next week, though, that I get all of them graded. All right. Any questions? I have to actually switch over and start. I have a meeting with my European history kids. So unless you have another nagging question, I'm going to end the stream. All right. Y'all have a great day. And I will see you on Monday. Tomorrow is a teacher work day for us, so I'm not going to be posting anything online. Just continue to work on the stuff that's already there, and I'll post some new stuff on Monday. Y'all have a good day. Bye-bye.